Okay, so let's talk about R selected species and K selected species. So bottom line, in order for an entire species to survive, they've got to be able to reproduce and pass on their genetic information to their offspring. And hopefully that genetic information is good enough that it helped them to survive, and it's going to give their offspring the same advantages of survival as the parents had. So one strategy or a strategy for reproduction helps a species do it efficiently. So what might work for one species isn't going to necessarily work for another species. Most species can be categorized into one of two strategies in general terms, the R selected or the K selected. I don't know why R is lowercase and K is uppercase, but that's how it is. So on our picture here, you can see to the left is the R selected species, and you can see like an oyster has 500 million eggs laid every year. That's a lot of offspring. And then you can see as we go on, fish lay quite a few thousand eggs a year, frogs a couple hundred, rabbits about 12, bobcats 2 every year, and then the big apes about 1 every 5 years. So one thing we can see is the egg output versus the parental care. So on the left by the oysters, they put out millions literally of eggs, but there's no parental care involved. They just hope that some of those eggs survive and don't get eaten by other species. Whereas the ape has one or two offspring and they take care of it and they raise it and they make sure it has skills and knowledge to be able to survive. So these are two very different strategies. And we kind of have a little bit of varied strategies in between those two extremes. So biotic potential definition, the maximum rate a population can grow without any restrictions under ideal conditions, unlimited food, shelter, resources. If that happened, then the population would just skyrocket and get out of control and never be curbed or regulated or stopped. It would just be out of control population. Imagine if all the species on the planet had no biotic potential, or only biotic potential, and it was never reached, and they just kept going and going and going. We'd be very overpopulated with all the everything that lives here. So what happens is there's things that regulate unlimited growth, and we call those limiting factors. We've talked about those before, and that helps curb the biotic potential. The way a population is distributed can also influence the reproductive strategy that a species chooses, the R or the K. On the left, clumping is the most common strategy we see. Safety in numbers, they kind of group together, they protect each other, they have social interactions, they're nearby for mating, they help each other care for their young, and the resources are clumped together. Uniform is not quite as common. They use it because the resources are scarce. You would see it in a desert. Plants are maximally distanced, kind of like our social distancing right now, to have the roots spread out and get the most water and not have to share that very rare or scarce resource. Random is hard to figure out, but it's just kind of no rhyme or reason. It just basically survives where it's at, and it happens to be there, and it tries to make that happen. But most are clumped for some reason, usually because of where resources are. So a K strategist has a lot of features, lots of traits, and you just straight out need to memorize them and be able to tell the difference between a K and an R strategist or selected species. They're usually large, their bodies are usually larger, they don't have as many offspring, and they spend a lot of energy raising that offspring, and so they want to concentrate their resources to the few offspring, not many offspring. The environment they live in is pretty stable. There's not a lot of scarcity going on in the environment. Again, they raise their young, they have long lives themselves, and they'll usually reproduce more than once. They'll have offspring for a few years, then in a few more years they'll have another offspring. They're density dependent. Make sure you know what that word means, look it up. They live in an area with high competition for resources, so it's not easy where these species live. They're always in competition with individuals of their own species and other species. A K strategist is less likely to be an invasive species for a few reasons. So I want you to think about why. They're in a stable environment, they're in these big communities. Even though there's a lot of competition, they're not going to take off and go be an invasive species. They have no reason really to leave. Are selected strategists. So they've got smaller bodies. They produce a lot of offspring and they don't use as much energy to do so because they don't raise their young. A lot of times they'll die after laying their eggs or reproducing. They usually exist in a fairly unstable environment. They have a very short lifespan. They don't live long. And they are density independent. Make sure you know what that means. And they are more likely to be an invasive species. And I want you to think why that would be true. Given all these facts, why would they be more likely to be an invasive species? So here's a table kind of summing up everything. So make sure you're able to know the differences. It's a big deal, both on multiple choice and FRQs, that you know the difference between a R selected and a K selected. And then the bottom part, R selected usually follow a type 3 survivorship curve, whereas K selected will follow either type 1 or type 2 survivorship curves. We will talk about those in the next lesson. So if you don't know what that is, you can look in your book or you can wait until our next lesson. Now some species do a little bit of both. Some are R selected, some are K selected, but some kind of use a combination of strategies from each and kind of do their own thing. Those are usually the songbirds, or lots of birds do that, squirrels do that, and this little guy is called a hydra in the ocean. They use that strategy as well. Okay, so hopefully that kind of gives you a rundown between R and K strategists, and stay tuned, we'll continue more soon.